you know, we have at least one client or prospect on the call who has had an employee test positive. So if y'all could address that as we go. And the other thing I was want to say, we actually have a couple of competitors of ours on the webinar here. So we want to say thank you. Glad we could help you out too.
All right, so with that in mind, guys, there are some questions that we will go through, but I wanted to start off, Anthony, with you. First, I'm going to read your bio, so you can introduce you to everybody else. And by the way, I switched the view. I turned off the self-running presentation, and so now you probably either see Anthony or a clustering of the panelists. Is that, you guys see that?
Yep.
Yeah, and if you wanted to change the audience, if you wanted to change the view, there probably is something you can select where it will say gallery view instead of speaker view, so that way you can see all 4 screens up there. So let me get started with Anthony. Anthony Scardino is the president of Scardino HR Partners. He established his business at the beginning of 2020. From March 2016 until the end of 2019, he served as the director of total rewards and global mobility at Frank's International, where he directed the design, strategy development, and maintenance of all compensation and executive compensation program after the company's IPO in 2013. In this role, he also led the transformation of Frank's benefit programs, including the development and rollout of the company's first high-deductible health plan and transition to both the company's 401k and equity record keepers. Before joining Frank's, he held various HR and total reward roles at Tesco Corporation and Halliburton. Anthony graduated with a BBA in finance and an MS in human resource management from Texas A&M. And he currently serves on the board of directors for Houston Compensation and Benefits. He accredits this unique combination of experience and education to his biggest professional strength, and that's bringing an analytical and operations-minded approach to HR. And what I like to say is, Anthony can speak CFO. That is just probably the easiest way to say it. So, Anthony, with that in mind, given your background in industry and what you're doing right now, what are most employers doing right now? And what is the number one thing that you would suggest that they need to do as they contemplate either reopening or how they address their employees with some type of pandemic response plan?
Yeah, so I'd say the big thing is that there's no wrong approach outside of making no changes. You know, I think some of us are tired of hearing that there's a new normal now, but the truth of the matter is there is a new normal. Whether that's how the office looks, who's in the office, or what have you, there have to be changes made and accommodations made to get that workforce back in there and get them in there safely. As far as the energy space goes, there's actually some new things happening that traditionally haven't happened, especially on the oil field services side. One of those things is going out and asking employees what they're comfortable doing. So historically, you know, my experience both in mid-size and large oil and gas companies is that there is a very hierarchical approach where the decisions made at the top then pushed down through the organization. Well, right now, given everything that's going on, one of the best things that I'm seeing is a use of tools like SurveyMonkey to go out there and actually poll the employees to see what they're comfortable doing. So, you know, I think we'll eventually start talking about, you know, what the office space looks like, who's in which spot, are there panels in between cubes now to make sure that we've got proper distancing in place. Well, now the employees are actually able to get out there and tell you, you know, I'm a at-risk employee, but I'm totally comfortable coming back in the office. You know, I saw one of the questions come from Nicole. They've got employees that are at risk that are itching to come back in the office. And that's one of the notes that I've made the last couple of weeks. There probably is a subset of that population that's ready to be back in the office. Maybe you've got 3 or 4 kids at the house and it's impossible to get anything done in an effective manner. You're ready to get back in the office. Or maybe you're a sales employee that's got to go call on clients, or you're in a role that requires a lot of collaboration. You know, a lot of those guys and girls are probably ready to get back into the office, but you won't know that until you go ask those questions. So just the fact that employees are actually asking, their employers are actually asking those questions of the employees now and figuring out what works best for their employee population and then planning after they have that data is a step change that I've seen in oil field services and the energy sector in general. That for me it's you know, a pretty novel and a really good idea. As far as getting people back in the office, one of the best ideas that I've seen is a reorientation of sorts. So I hit on that you know, catchphrase of new normal a little bit earlier. But now that we are starting to get employees back in the office and we've come to the conclusion that things aren't like they used to be anymore, well, now it's the responsibility of HR, HSC, and the executive teams at your companies to say, okay, now that we are back in the office and things are different, things look different, maybe 50% of the office staff is here today, 50% will be here tomorrow. There's an expectation that things will change. But just like with any change, if you don't communicate that change to the employees in an effective manner, they're not going to know the expectations of you as the management team or you as the general counsel or head of HR or whatever your position is. So getting everybody back into the office and on their first day back, having that reorientation. You don't have to give everybody back their I-9s and their W-2 information and what have you, but sitting down and talking about, okay, here's what the expectation is for meeting rooms, shared spaces, even something as simple as, we may have a smaller restroom, so we don't want 2 or 3 people in the restroom at the same time because it is a closed, confined space. And as the CDC will tell you, it's probably more of an at-risk space, especially if you're in there for any extended period of time. So getting the employees back into the office and having that reorientation and really getting them to understand what your perspective is as an employer or a leader at your organization is crucial. I think Henry will probably talk a little bit about accommodations, but before you get individuals back into the office, understand that, especially for your higher risk employees, you're probably going to have to make some sort of accommodation. It could be an easy accommodation. I know at Frank's, where I worked last, we had a good deal of office space and cubes and a fairly large, cube farm where we had probably 300 to 400 square feet where no one was. So if I've got an at-risk employee who's only going to feel comfortable coming back to the office if he or she can be in a space where they're not surrounded by other potential carriers, the accommodation may be moving them out of their old cube or old office and into an office that is less surrounded by other employees. So, but between the reorientation and just understanding that changes do have to be made, that the old way of doing things has to change, that's really what I'm saying. And again, that reorientation is one of the most effective things that I've done to be able to communicate and effectively get your employee population to understand what the expectations are of them in this new normal at the office.
Okay, so Anthony, you said a lot of things, but I just want to make sure I highlighted what I heard you say. First, it's a new world, right? And that the way that you did business in the past, as of 2.5 months ago, that needs to change. So what I heard you say is you're seeing a lot of employers taking a more of a dynamic approach to employee feedback, whether there be some type of online survey or some type of approach to take information. And I think what I also heard you say is the most important thing is if you take that information, you've got to do something with it. You must take action to show that you're sensitive to employees' feedback, but also integrate that as a part of your response plan. You must do an environmental assessment, and I'm sure that both Luke and Henry will talk about that, but an environmental assessment in probably not a way that you've thought of in the past. I mean, it's literally like, where can this thing hide within our place of business? Reorientation. So just assume it's your first day of work all over again for however many employees that you have, but be very mindful of what the plan is. And then finally, communicate, and then provide some level of understanding for special needs or accommodations. Did I get that?
That's absolutely right.
Fantastic. I just want to make sure. Fantastic. Great feedback, and thank you for that. So now I'm going to introduce Luke Blankenship. Luke is the Director of HR for Aldridge. He is responsible for all HR initiatives, including recruiting, onboarding, training, development, coaching, and counseling. That's a lot of stuff, man. Since joining Aldridge in 2008, Luke has helped manage the organization's rapid growth by proactively planning, recruiting, spearheading business partnerships, and successfully integrating multiple acquisitions. He credits his success with the ability to adapt to change, whether it be job market volatility or economic uncertainty. Luke is able to help department heads ensure employee success by being nimble when needed and have a foundation that supports the long-term company vision. So Luke, you're as an HR director and as a company that's already gone through some level of a response plan, can you give an understanding of what you had to do, or what was your mindset and the planning process to bring your folks back? And before that, talk a little bit about what Aldridge does.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So we are an IT solutions provider. We provide outsourced IT support for small, mid-sized businesses in the Houston, Dallas, Seattle markets. We have clients though all over the country in all different industries. We're not particularly verticalized, with any particular one industry. Think of us as, your IT department or a company's IT department. We work with companies, everything from their support desk up through, high-level IT consulting projects. So a lot of companies, do hire us to be their full-service outsourced IT provider. And yeah, we have rolled out a phased approach to returning to the office. We started back with the leadership team last Tuesday. So the day after Memorial Day was our first day back. And our goal really was to evaluate the office space, evaluate the precautions that we had taken during the time between mid-March when we all started working from home and that period to make sure we had proper protective gear in place, to make sure we had proper ways to social distance. We're in a building that we don't own, and so obviously there are other tenants, and so one of the big concerns is how do we protect people once they walk outside our doors. And really the way I got to the plan that we rolled out was just looking at a ton of different plans that are already out there. It was not reinventing the wheel. It was sort of piecing together little bits and pieces of other plans that were released. Of course, every business is unique and everyone's going to have their own individual challenges based on space. We're lucky and fortunate enough to have plenty of space to be able to bring everyone back safely. And our plan is to do so by June 15th on that phased approach. But not every company is lucky, and I certainly understand that there have to be other provisions for those companies who simply don't have the space to make folks feel safe and be safe. But yeah, we took that time between mid-March and the end of May and really started stocking up and coming to the office in investigative sort of ways to be able to see what we need to do and ultimately I did put together a plan that I feel very confident will get everyone back safely. We have cubicles in between everyone. We have signage everywhere. We have the typical face mask available. We have hand sanitizers all over the place, and so and a lot of things we learned after we got back. After the management team came back, and we had this plan fully baked and rolled out, and then we had to make some adjustments. And so part of my advice would certainly be to make sure that you are monitoring whatever plan you have put in place. Make sure that you stay on top of that, and if there are changes needed, make sure you do that quickly. One of our big changes was we wanted to make people feel safe, but also not force things upon people that they may have personal issues with or whatever the reason. And so initially our plan was that we would only require masks when you are not able to social distance. And what we learned was that was too vague. And the fact is anytime you leave your own personal space, your workspace, your office, there's no way to guarantee social distancing. You could easily run into someone on the other side of a door or around a corner or in a hallway. And so we modified, and now masks are required anytime you leave your personal workspace or office. And so, and I'm happy to share, the plan that we put together. Again, it sort of pieces together tons of different options out there. And some of it is very specific to us. And we have to do different things in different offices. We operate 3 offices in Houston, Dallas, and Seattle. And so each of those offices is unique. And a lot of those cities and states have different rules about coming back. And I'm sure the real Henry could speak more to, how that works from a legal standpoint. But you just have to be mindful of all of that as you start rolling out a plan and getting everyone back safely.
Well, thank you. Luke, what I heard you say is, one, you used a consulting term where you just took a bunch of information and found out which model or which one worked better for you, but then you customized it and gave it life based on the unique organizational culture and nuances that you have. You had a phased approach, and what I heard you say is we had the leadership team come back first, so we could kind of be learning and have a set of eyes that this is like our first time here, so let's let's figure out what we need to figure out so when the people come back on June 15th that we're ready for it. We have a plan that we can adjust. What I also heard you say is you got to have a plan, but then you have to give the plan life. So you can't just have a plan and set it on the side. You must continuously review that and adjust as needed. And then the last thing is that you're happy to share your plan if anybody wants it. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, and just to follow up something, is we also realized we didn't have a plan for work from home. That was never really a systematic approach that we had. We were very much in the office culture. And so all of a sudden we're all working from home. We didn't have a policy. We didn't have a plan. We didn't have anything around that. And so, lots of things obviously have come to light during this process. And one of those things is, if you have folks working from home and plan to continue doing that, I would highly recommend a documented work from home policy or, some guidelines, which is something that we are also in the process of working on and rolling out because we didn't have it either. So.
Thanks, Luke. Hey, while we're at it, I'd like to say, if for anybody after we get done with this webinar, we're happy to introduce y'all to any of these three panelists. The other thing is we'll also have follow-up notes. So if there's something we don't answer or information we need to get out, we'll disseminate that in an email afterward.
So Luke, one last question, because I'm sure we'll get to cyber liability and how you actually, as a business, need to consider that in preparation. But one of the things relative to what you said is, what is the wackiest thing or the thing that was the biggest surprise during your leadership coming back and what you just didn't expect to happen? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think it's a very big two-part question. Cybersecurity is huge. Again, we have a cybersecurity policy, and so when you get a lot of folks working from home, some of that guard gets let down of links that you might click on that you may not otherwise click on if you're in the office and sort of in that mindset. Now you're working from home, and are you using your personal computer? Are you using your work computer? So tons of different risk of there. That's a whole other webinar in itself. About the risk associated with working from home and the liability that could bring. But I think the biggest thing that we realized coming back is everything. The office was just, none of this was ever considered about how much space we needed to have. Do we have to require masks, or can we make it optional when you leave your office space? Well, you have to make it required now. We realized that. We thought we had enough space where everyone could spread out, but again, behind every door, you could run into someone. Our public restrooms, are not designed to be able to social distance. The sinks are right next to each other. So a lot of the things that were out of our control, once you leave the confines of our four walls. And then, another thing that I know a lot of folks, it's not part of our return to office plan. It's probably not a lot of, of anyone else, is just the, what happens when everyone gets back to the office and starts plugging in everything and nothing works? I mean, I'm a perfect example. This is probably the first time I've used my webcam since I got back. And, I tried to log in here and then it didn't work. And so imagine a company with, 100, 200 folks all returning at once, which is why I think a phased approach makes a lot of sense for a lot of different reasons, is get everyone back, get them safely back, but also allow folks to get back and get everything set up and working again. Make sure their printers are working, their monitors are working. I work for an IT company. I'm not necessarily an IT guru. And I can tell you the first day I came back to the office, it took me 30 minutes to get everything set back up again. And, and still I'm finding things that just aren't quite working right. And so I think that's one of the biggest considerations is, yes, we can get people back safely. We can have hand sanitizers, masks, social distancing, all of that. But you're going to find other things that you just simply don't think about. And IT and infrastructure is one of those big things.
Okay, so now what I heard you say, it's kind of like be baseball ready because you don't know what's going to come at you. All right, so Henry, we saved the attorney for last, and we didn't see any objections just yet. So happy to introduce you and ask a leading question. So Henry is a partner in the litigation practice, chair of the employment practice, co-chair of the oil and gas industry team, and also a member of the background screening and hospitals and health systems industry teams. He helps employers, service providers, and boards of directors solve their most complex legal dilemmas. Nationally, he serves as lead counsel in litigation across 30 jurisdictions, taking dozens of cases to verdict before juries and arbitration tribunals. He is acting outside general counsel and a key attorney for clients in the background screening, employee benefits, energy, and healthcare industries. Henry advises management teams leading negotiation of employment contracts, equity, and other benefits in corporate acquisitions. He carefully counsels clients through some of their most sensitive matters, including internal investigations, executive separation, earnout, and fiduciary duty disputes. Wow, that's a lot, Henry. Welcome, bud.
Thank you very much.
So my question for you to start it off is probably going to be multifold, but what are the biggest legal challenges that you see businesses facing in the context of reopening?
So what businesses want most of all is certainty. They want to know what rules apply. Is that better from a sound perspective? Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Businesses want certainty. They want to give me the rules, let me know what I need to follow them, let me plan for them, let me budget them, and let me tell my employees this is what you need to do. We are in the scenario where there is a complete lack of that, because what states have done for the most part from mid-March forward is set restrictions. They're telling you what you can't do. They're not necessarily telling you what you should do. They're just telling you what you can't do. Now states are rolling those restrictions back. So, from Luke's perspective, he has offices in Texas and he has offices in Washington State. Probably pretty significantly different restrictions are in place in those jurisdictions. So right now, you still are being told what you can't do in certain locations. But no one has said, if you do these things, you are in effect insulated from liability, from your employees, from customers, if you're in a high customer contact space. Congress hasn't filled that gap. I mean, there was discussion, at least in the Senate, about trying to incorporate some liability shields in some of the stimulus efforts that have come out, but that hasn't gotten any traction. There really hasn't been that at the state level either. So businesses are faced with the dilemma of potentially being sued for not being reasonable, because that's what has become the de facto test. And let me tell you, as a litigator for 25 plus years, reasonable is in the eye of the beholder in a lot of times. So what we're trying to advise our clients, and not just from a risk standpoint, but from a comfort standpoint, because both Luke and Anthony were talking about the need to get employee feedback, get people comfortable coming back to work. I noticed what Anthony was saying about companies for the first time maybe are communicating with people in the field about how they're comfortable. And so what you're trying to do is establish a baseline of reasonability so people are comfortable coming back. People are confident that if they're in the workplace, they are going to be safe. And so right now, the best thing that employers, businesses can do is have, as Luke talked about, a very sound return to work plan that factors all of the physical and environmental components of how do we make you safe, but also places expectations on your employees about how they're supposed to behave in the workplace. It's kind of like that you can describe it softly as a good neighbor approach. Mm-hmm. How, if Luke and I are working together as co-employees of a company, how do we take care of each other and make sure that we're both safe, feel comfortable, and can then do our job? And so you want to have a clear return to work plan and policy that communicates to your employees that these are what the expectations are. And you want to enforce that policy just like you would enforce your sexual harassment policy, your anti-discrimination policies. And you want buy-in from the top. The companies that I think are struggling are the companies that have a challenge with buy-in from the top. I mean, I was on a call last week where you have the CEO of the company who's unwilling to wear a mask walking around outside of his office. That's a really difficult climate to go ahead and instill the values. And this is a manufacturing company, by the way.
Wow.
So, I mean, they necessarily have people who are on top of each other. And your heavy manufacturing companies are probably the ones that have the most difficulty right now in terms of the configuration of their workspace and how do we work safely. Because, I mean, the litigation that's come out so far, I mean, you had certainly litigation in manufacturing, meat processing, nursing homes, sort of the lowest hanging fruit. And all those cases talk about you were not reasonable. You know, you knew of certain factors, you knew of certain exposure or likely exposure incidents, and you didn't follow, for example, CDC guidance, which right now is probably the benchmark for what's considered reasonable. So you need to factor all of that and be flexible because guidance changes. I mean, I think right now we're learning things about how COVID may spread that's different from what we knew 3 weeks ago. Like surface level transmission probably isn't as much of a perceived risk as it was 4 weeks ago. So we need to just constantly be abreast of what those best practices are and continue to evolve, be flexible, listen to your employees, have that open mind and open door, and continue to evolve as the facts evolve in the pandemic.
So someone tests positive, a manufacturing company has an employee who tests positive. What next?
So if you have an employee who tests positive, I mean, the first thing is you need to quarantine that person. So getting the person safely out of the office is step number one, assuming that they're in the office when you learn that fact. The second thing would be to evaluate where that person has had exposure within the facility. So, and then you probably need to go ahead and engage in a deep cleaning, recommend getting an outside service to do that. Come in, do a deep cleaning. You may need to shut areas of your facility down. You may, depending on how your facility is arranged, you may need to shut the entire facility around to allow that deep cleaning to take place. The next thing is contact tracing. So what the CDC and best practices are recommending that you do is you talk to the employee. Hopefully you're in a position where you're able to do that and get information from him or her about who they may have had prolonged exposure to. And what that typically means is exposure within 6 feet. For the time frame, there's no 10, 15 minutes of within 6 feet exposure. And so you get that list of people. Then you go to those persons. Now, unless you have permission, you are not supposed to disclose the name of the person who tested positive. That is still considered confidential health information protected under various employment laws. And then you go ahead and talk to those people and encourage, if you believe there are prolonged exposure, other persons with that, then you encourage them to quarantine or get tested and see where they are. And generally speaking, there's a look back period with respect to the employee who tested positive. You want to look back for a certain period of time before they were symptomatic and try to figure out the contact tracing within that window of time. One thing that I came up over the weekend is what do you do about customers? To the extent that you are a customer-facing organization. You may have regulatory requirements in that regard. For example, if you're in the healthcare space specifically, there may be regulatory requirements about who you need to conduct contact tracing with, for example, residents of nursing homes. But as a general matter, like if you're a retail establishment, there isn't a requirement to do contact tracing with respect to customers. And then that becomes a real business decision about what you want to do in that regard, if anything.
So, Henry, you had made a couple of observations about what guidance we're getting from federal and state, and can you just summarize that? Because my understanding is there's really not a lot of guidance, and it's really more of a question of when you say reasonable. What I'd like to have you answer that question, but then also on top of that, say where do most employers screw up when it comes to being sued in a court of law? Does that make sense?
So, sure. So there isn't I mean, CDC is issuing guidance as CDC would in response to any health crisis. CDC's job is not to set the legal framework for businesses to operate in. But in effect, because of the vacuum that otherwise exists, both at the federal and state level, CDC guidance is becoming the default standard of reasonability. If you look at the lawsuits that have been filed since the pandemic, where, for example, might be a wrongful death case where somebody in a plant got sick, died because there was mass exposure in the plant, those persons are always, the lawsuits are always talking about, you did not follow CDC guidance. So it's become, in effect, the default standard because of the vacuum otherwise. Where companies tend to screw up is they don't have documented plans. They don't have documented policies. Or can't, I mean, and of course, there's going to be, hopefully, the outlier situations of people who just ignore the obvious. The person who is, going to Carter's point, the person who is positive and the company, look, people may be positive and not really sick, but okay, you're not sick, continue to work. Well, that's a problem if you do that, you know, but I mean, hopefully you're not dealing with these outlier situations, but companies get in trouble because they don't communicate and or they're rigid in how they're in their approach to responding to the problem.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Nicole Miller, and I'd like for all of you to kind of weigh on this because it touches a lot of bases. It says the employees I have out want to come back, but I and our owner wouldn't be able to morally handle if they came back, got sick and died. We tried thinking of it from a business standpoint instead of personal. We're small, but we are small and cannot remove the personal aspect. We do not have the ability to keep them away from others, but they are not concerned for themselves. We are the concerned party. And so I guess there's a lot of questions in there. As one is from a business perspective, so Luke and Anthony, how would you guys respond to that? But I guess the first question would be is, can you make employees come back to work? And then how would you all respond to that from either a consultant perspective, a business perspective, and a legal perspective?
I'll go ahead and start. I'll try and handle as many of the questions in here as possible. I would say that from a personal standpoint, think about the things that these employees are doing on a day-to-day basis. Before all of this happened, you were asking them to drive into the office every day. There's inherent risk, and I think that some of the things that I've seen, the risk associated with that commute, especially if I'm in Houston and I'm commuting from the Woodlands to downtown every day, there's a significant amount of risk with that commute every day. So understand that what you're asking them to do from purely a statistic standpoint is not all that different than what you were asking them to do before from putting themselves at risk. Also, if they're the ones that are itching to come back into the office, chances are they've already gone to the grocery store, gone to Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace Hardware, been places where they could have potentially exposed themselves before. So like I talked about kind of in my opening statement, if they are willing to, take whatever risk is associated with coming into the office, and they're the ones coming to you saying, I want to be in there. It's, I feel an obligation to be in the office, to interact with my colleagues on a day-to-day basis, then really it's out of your hands at that point. It's your prerogative to make sure that what you're doing when they're there ensures the safety or the greatest amount of safety as possible once they are in the office. But at a certain point, it's out of your hands. And like I mentioned earlier, they've probably already done things that have, at least in the very least, exposed themselves in some way, shape, or form to contraction of COVID.
Luke, what's your response as the HR guy and the business guy?
Yeah, I agree with Anthony on most of those, everything he said, actually. I think it's easy, certainly in a smaller company. We were very small. When I started here, we were less than 10 people. So it's very easy to have that personal connection and have, have those feelings from a personal standpoint. But from a business standpoint, Anthony's exactly right. If this person feels safe coming back to the office, chances are they are doing all the things, going to restaurants, maybe they're going to bars, going to the grocery store. And so, I think the only thing we can do is make sure it's as safe as possible. But from a standpoint of if someone wants to come back and we feel that we've done everything we could do to keep them as safe as possible, then, I would say let them come back. And I think, you sort of ask another question, which is a bigger question that Henry probably would have more input on is, can you make people come back to work? This is obviously a different question from Nicole's point of view, because no one's trying to make him come back to work. He wants to come back to work. But yeah, can you make people come back to work? Yeah, yes, is the answer. Of course, you have to follow, if they have a valid reason, the CARES Act, and that's a whole separate conversation. But I don't believe there's any government agency or any legal entity out there telling you, that you can just simply refuse in order to come back to work. Again, unless you meet some qualifications that are out there that existed prior to COVID, and as part of the CARES Act, whether you are, childcare, the caveat with not having childcare, having symptoms, taking care of someone with symptoms. So, but yeah, that's my opinion. Is if someone wants to come back, then I think what a lot of businesses are going to be faced with is the opposite. Is, we're ready to come back. We want people to come back, but I don't want to come back. I don't feel safe coming back. So I think that's where the challenge really is, from my point of view. Luckily, we haven't had any of those conversations yet. We've got some childcare things that we're working out and working through and helping some employees. But for the most part, had very little pushback to our plan. And I think that's because of the preparations and the time that we took to build it and publish it. And, there was from what Anthony was talking about, getting feedback. We published it, 3-4 weeks before everyone had to be back in the office, to give plenty of time for people to make childcare arrangements, ask questions, give us concerns. So I think that's another really good point I want to make, is give folks time to weigh in. If on a Friday afternoon you release a plan that says everybody has to be back in the office on Monday, well, if we've been working from home for 6-8 weeks, that doesn't give people really time to plan things that they may have to plan out. So, I think that's a good piece of advice as well.
So what Luke mentioned, first of all, I completely agree in terms of encouraging and how to deal with the employees who want to come back to work. I would also mention that, and Luke mentioned that teleworking wasn't a part of what they did, and now they've been forced to telework. Can continue to consider that option, particularly for people who may be at higher risk, assuming they're in positions that can telework. For the employees who are resistant to come back to work, first I'll start with going back to teleworking. Can they? Because it's not an excuse not to work necessarily. And there may be reasons why you have to consider teleworking, even if you were historically and still resistant to it. Your state restrictions for certain categories of employees. I know in Georgia, notwithstanding that you could go get a tattoo on April 24th in Georgia, at least through June 12th, if you're 65 or over, or have certain COVID-specific symptoms, employers are encouraged to allow those people to telework. That's still in the governor's order here. But otherwise, you can, subject to accommodations for disabilities, teleworking may be one of those, extended leave, if it's not indefinite, may be one of those, but you can typically make people come back. And if they refuse to, you can treat that as a resignation situation. I mean, ironically, I know the CARES Act was mentioned. I mean, you are to maximize your loan forgiveness. If you have a PPP loan, you are supposed to tell state unemployment agencies these persons had a job to come back to, and they're not willing to do so. So, I mean, the government is certainly, at least in the context of the CARES Act and in unemployment generally, is trying to get people off the unemployment rolls and back onto employer paid rolls.
Okay, and then Kim asked a question about OSHA. Any guidance? I'll start with you, Henry.
Sure. So OSHA has there's a general duty clause in OSHA that requires employers to mitigate known hazards. I mean, the problem with COVID-19 is it's silent, it's invisible. So you have to have facts as an employer. They have to be pretty apparent to fall within the general duty clause. Sorry about that. My phone was ringing. You may have specific PPE requirements in OSHA that are industry specific, but there's nothing new in terms of, there's nothing COVID specific that OSHA's addressed. Like, you have to do this from a PPE standpoint. You either had those obligations before March or you don't. One thing that is new, and I probably should have mentioned when Carter mentioned the question about the client who had a COVID positive. As of May 26th, OSHA does have a requirement that employers investigate if the employee likely contracted COVID in the workplace. And if so, that's an OSHA reportable incident. I would offer to you that absent very obvious facts, in all likelihood, you're not going to know whether the employee contracted COVID in the workplace or in the grocery store or getting a tattoo in Georgia. Who knows?
So I would ask Luke to respond to that in terms of what are you guys doing? So if that happens in the workplace, can you talk through the OSHA guidelines, but then also what does your plan say you're going to do if and when that happens?
Yeah, so our general plan obviously is OSHA guidelines, keep the office safe, free of known harms, as Henry mentioned. We don't know what the known is because it's something floating in the air that you can't see. And so, we've taken every precaution that we possibly can, above and beyond what any of the guidelines even recommend, with, mask and, we have temperature checks. And, I know some organizations are actually requiring temperature checks and passing out masks every morning. We haven't gone that route yet, but we do have the ability to check temperatures, which is allowed. Again, treat this as any other health issue. If someone tests positive, it's confidential health information. You can't go blast around the office that someone is symptomatic or has tested positive. So it's really just treating this like any other disaster that may come your way. Any other accident that may happen in the workplace, confidentiality if someone does test positive, doing all the things that we already talked about as far as, do we need to shut down the office, professional cleaning, isolation, making sure when the folks come back to the office that they've been cleared by a medical professional. So not just taking their word for it, asking for those, that documentation. Those types of things are all things that I think businesses should be doing. Also want to maybe sort of ping Henry for a comment on, I know many of us are familiar with Vistage. And we have, for a while Vistage is a group of CEOs, business leaders that get together, share, business ideas, challenges, those types of things. It's a worldwide organization. But there for a while, there was a question floating around in Vistage. Should I have employees sign a waiver to come back to the office, saying that they will basically, if something happens, we are not at fault. I'd love to get Henry's opinion on that. Mine, from a non-legal standpoint, was, if you're doing all the right things, why would you need that? And it sort of, in my mind, just raises a red flag as a way for maybe some businesses who aren't, even able to do all the right things by purchasing all the PPE, doing the proper social distancing, So in my mind, from an HR standpoint and from, put myself as an employee, that's a red flag to me. And that was sort of my advice to everyone who asked me is, if you're doing all of the right things, I don't know that is necessary, especially since there's no cases that have been tried. So we have no idea how that would even, are those things even, valid, from that standpoint.
So I think you just touched on what you just said at the end of your comment, Luke, was, first of all, I agree with everything you said beforehand. From a cultural perspective, are you sending the right message? Secondly, I have serious doubts as to the enforceability of a waiver in the employee-employer relationship. I think there's a much more greater likelihood that that a waiver is enforceable in a customer context. You know, when I got my hair cut last week, I had to sign a waiver. I think there's a much more likelihood that that is enforceable. You can't abdicate your general duty responsibility under OSHA or under state law, and state law is going to vary, but you generally have an obligation to maintain a safe workplace in some respects, from physical hazards, for example, in Georgia. So you can't really waive that. I know businesses are, I've had clients ask me for that, and they've said, look, I don't care if it's not enforceable. I want that as a paper deterrent effect. And candidly, that's a cultural issue. What message do you want to send? But I have serious reservations in terms of the actual enforceability of that waiver. And candidly, I think in litigation, if you have an unenforceable waiver, it could come back and bite you. I know if I were representing the other side, I might try to make something of that.
I just want to say Luke's probably getting the best pose right now. If he's playing mannequin, he's doing a great job. At least he's frozen on my screen. But there's a question from Tina, specifically about somebody over the age of 65. And you're offering a job back, and you are considered an essential business. Employee states he falls within the age and should not return to work. And this comes back to, can you make people come back to work? Can you treat this as the person's resignation given those circumstances? So I've asked the legal opinion first, and then the feedback from Anthony and Luke, if he's still on. So
the legal opinion is, what do your state restrictions say? So your state guidance and your executive orders that your governor has issued, what does that say? Number one. Number two, is it just a general concern, or does that employee have a specific health condition that you may have to accommodate potentially with either teleworking or unpaid leave? But understand that indefinite unpaid leave is not a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So depending on those fact questions, you may be able to force that individual to choose between resignation or returning to work. I would caution, if you're doing that to the person who's 65, do it to the person that's 45 also, who's expressing the same skittishness, because you don't want to make the distinction based on a person's age. That could raise age discrimination concerns otherwise.
Yeah.
So I mean, one size fits all is tough right now.
Yeah, so Henry, what I heard you say is first check your state direction. Whatever the state says, you got to check with that first. And somebody like you could help with that. But then also it comes down to the litmus test is what you said initially is be reasonable. Be reasonable in terms of the interpretation. Is there accommodation that you can do to accommodate this person? And would you enforce that resignation essentially if they were younger than me or older than me? So I'm like the resident old guy. So
right.
I think the key here, and Henry hit on it, is consistency in the approach for your employee population. That's the big thing for me. I would say the other thing, as far as, what can you do with that employee? You put the ball in their court. Ask them the question, what can we do as an employer to help you feel comfortable in coming back to the office? That way you can figure out what kind of accommodations need to be made or what you can do for that employee to make sure they are comfortable coming back to the office. Maybe it is a teleworking situation, or maybe it's just a small accommodation you can make in the office for them.
Yeah. One thing about this that's interesting is through July 31st, unemployment benefits are a lot richer under the CARES Act. It's going to be interesting to see how this problem potentially changes come August 1st, when unemployment benefits and reduced hours being eligible for unemployment. When all that changes, I think things are going to change from what does the populace want to do? Because at some point, people have to feed their families.
Guys, it is 10:59, and so this is supposed to be an hour webinar. So if I do have a couple more questions, but I just also want to say, if the folks that are attending, if they need or want to leave, if they want to stick around, great, but we did say till 11. Well, what I would also ask, I wanted to ask some transition questions. And Anthony, I don't know if you have a specific or some specific areas that you want to make sure we address during this time we have left.
Yeah, no, I heard Luke mention Vistage, and I've seen a few questions come across from employers there. One of them is surrounding sick time and how can we encourage employees to use sick time and sick banks. And so I've actually seen a couple of exciting things start to happen with PTO banks. One of them that is, goes back to a couple of Harvard business case studies is actually eliminating sick banks. So there's some employers that have paid out any unused PTO at the end of the year. So that in some ways encourages employees to potentially come to the office sick. So if I no longer have that bank of PTO, be it vacation, sick leave, etc., I no longer have this carrot out there that's driving employees to come into the office. Now, it does a couple things for you as an employer. One, most of us will have an accrual on the books for PTO that would be paid out at the end of the year. Well, now you can get rid of that accrual. If you're a mid to large size company, you can put that accrual to some pretty interesting things. In the oil and gas space, PTO or paid time off for maternity or paternity leave is almost non-existent in a lot of cases. I've seen some employers start to consider taking that accrual from their PTO, their sick banks, their vacation time that they'd otherwise have on the books and start putting that towards paid paternity and maternity leaves. So now you're offering a benefit that a lot of your competitors may not be considering and may not be offering. So I think that, as much as, consternation and as much bad has come from this illness, I think it's started to drive employers to be creative and at least on the oil field services side and in the energy space, move into the 21st century as far as the benefit offerings and some of the offerings they offer to their employers.
So I want to ask, Luke, I don't know, are you still there, Luke? Because you're in that post for a long time.
I am here.
Oh, cool. Okay, because I don't know if you're frozen on my screen, so unfortunately the recording's probably going to have me frozen for the last part of this webinar. But you look great. That's a fantastic post. Wanted to just talk a little bit about a time to review status quo and feedback from all of you, because this, there is some good that's coming from this, and that my sense is that businesses have to focus on what they need to do and what they could do differently. So some of it's probably learning as you go. It's like, hey, well, we didn't really realize that we didn't need this aspect of our business. Or you have to think very critically about everything that you do and kind of break the toy, break the model, and put it back together a little bit more efficiently or more thoughtfully. So feedback from you, Anthony. What in terms of changing the status quo, what are you seeing in general that is some good that's coming out of what we're coming through right now?
As I mentioned earlier, a lot of it is asking the employees what they want. There's been a demand from the younger generation in the workplace to have things like telecommuting or teleworking, work from home, or the hashtag that I've seen recently is work from anywhere. And that is something that employers are seeing has worked for them. The last 2 months, I'd say a vast majority, especially of your corporate staff, has been working from home. And there's been concerns in the past, in the energy sector that, I'm afraid to have this policy put into place. I'm afraid to have some sort of flexible work schedule put into place because I just don't think my employees are going to be as productive anymore. And they've actually had their IT departments in a way, monitoring the productivity of their employees while they're at home and have been working from home the last 2 months. And they've realized that productivity hasn't changed for these employees. They're just as productive from a work standpoint working at home as they ever were in the office. And in a lot of cases, they're more productive. You cut out a lot of the distractions that you have in the office. One of the things that I miss about being in the office with everybody is, the camaraderie and, standing around and, talking at the water cooler or having someone stop in your office and chit chat for 5 or 10 minutes. But if you've got a larger office and you've got 5 or 10 people stopping by for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, there's an hour of your day that's disappeared. If I'm driving from, Pearland to the north side of Houston or from Katy downtown, that's an hour each way in the car. So from just a mathematics standpoint, people are wasting, days at a time on commutes that they otherwise wouldn't have to do if they were telecommuting. So just employers starting to look at things they hadn't considered before because there was that assumption that they just weren't going to work. But now they've got that empirical evidence that says, you know what, this actually does work. And not only does it work, it works better than having someone in the office 5 days a week. And then the feedback that I've gotten just from some former colleagues and friends of mine, I'd say 90 to 95% are more productive at home, both from a work standpoint and from taking care of the things that they need to take care of the house, whether it's spending time with kids, wife, husband, etc., getting chores done, tasks done around the house that would otherwise have been put off to the weekends, so they can finally reestablish that positive, productive time with families that a lot of us have, quite frankly, missed since we've entered the workforce. So I think that the status quo is changing, and it may cause a little bit of a headache, but by and large, I think the changes are positive changes for both the employer and the employees.
And I think the good thing that's going to come out of this is, as you're kind of figuring out that your status quo, when you're questioning that stuff, is hopefully it becomes infectious and you ask that of every aspect of your business, because I think then you'll even have more efficiency that comes from it. Luke, I want to ask you a question in terms of folks that are considering some type of teleworking or telecommuting policy. From your perspective, what are things that employers should be mindful of that they may not be thinking through, or things that obviously could be harmful to their business?
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick and brief here. I know we're running out of time, but one thing I just wanted to mention, we've all talked about things to do and not do. Just going back to sort of HR 101, make sure these conversations with employees are documented. Mm-hmm. So if you're having these employees who are saying, I don't want to come back, and they're not really giving you a reason, you need all that documented, what your response is documented. As Henry was saying, if this ever does get to a legal issue, you need to have your bases covered, have a plan. Secondly, talking about PTO specifically, Anthony brought that up. What's going to happen at the end of this year? If travel restrictions are lifted, no one's been taking PTO the first half of this year. Does that mean everyone's going to want to take PTO at the end of the year? So something else to keep in mind that you may not be considering is, if you have those policies, sort of use it or lose it. Everyone's going to come knocking, November, December. Even if they don't end up going anywhere, they're going to want their time off. And so keep that in mind. But from a work from home policy, I think that needs to tie into your culture. I've seen some policies where employees have to take pictures of their office, their home office, and submit to HR once a month, once a quarter. Do you need to monitor phone calls? If you're a customer service, we have a big part of our business is help desk, so on the phone support. And so, we are monitoring phone calls to make sure there are not dogs barking in the background, babies crying in the background. It really just depends on your business, your culture. What do you need from the employee? Hourly employees who would normally be spending an hour to drive into the office, are they starting work at the same time? Are you getting the same number of hours out of the employee? Are they tracking their time appropriately? Are they taking lunch breaks? So at the end of the day, it's not a lot different than managing folks in the office. You just can't see them. And so, we've been managing all of our managers, in fact, are in Houston, mm-hmm. but we have employees in Dallas and Seattle. And so we've been managing remote employees now for years. And really, I think it's interesting to note is when everyone went to work from home, everyone was then on equal ground, right? You can't walk down the hall and talk to someone. You have to call them, or you have to schedule a video call. So that's actually was a big eye opener for us is, some of the folks in our remote offices didn't have the same interaction that the folks in our Houston office has, which is our main corporate office. And so it put everyone on the same playing field. And so I thought that was an interesting observation. And so I think as people start coming back to the office, keep that in mind, and keep those things going so that everyone's on the same playing field.
Okay, thank you for that. And you know what? To add to that, I used to be the head of sales and account management for Blue Cross eons ago. And the customer service centers, the people that answer the phones, when they got to a certain level of experience, they could work from home. And that was considered a benefit. What I'm hearing you guys say is that's now becoming an expectation, and you need to review whether or not you can accommodate that within your business, but then also be somewhat flexible with whatever the business needs are in combination with the people needs as well.
Yeah. And real quick, we were one of those companies that said we can't work from home. You know, our call center needs to be centralized. We need to have people in seats. It just doesn't work. Yeah. But it did. We made it work. So yes, you're exactly right. I think, and even, you know, from a recruiting standpoint, I've had folks already ask, you know, what's your work from home policy? You know, more so now than ever before. You know, can we work from home? What did you do during COVID? And people want to know what your response was, and they want to know they're working for a quality company that did the right thing.
What Luke just said is really important. You're having to test assumptions, and that's a very, very good thing. Just because you've always done something doesn't mean that's the best way of doing it.
Yeah,
and I think that's what we're learning right now more than anything else.
Yeah, and so to wrap it up, guys, and Luke, there's a deeper conversation to how you prepare your company from cyber liability, from a telework policy, from all of that stuff, and your business does that. And so I presume if somebody wants a deeper conversation about that, they can reach out to you. But just in closing, let's start with Henry, then Luke, then Anthony. Just anything that you want to add about the conversation today, maybe we didn't address, and then how do people get a hold of you?
No, I think what's important about the conversation, I think we talked about a lot of principles that apply to a lot of different kinds of situations. Mm-hmm. I would say things are very fluid right now. Feel free, if you have any specific questions, to reach out to any of us. Mm-hmm. You can get a hold of me at my firm's website, www.a as in apple, g as in gold, g as in gold.com, henry.perlowski@agg.com. Happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thanks for letting me join this group.
You can be down with AGG and get a hold of Henry. And I would also say when you're in that moment where something happens, and you just need some framework of a response that would allow to factor in some legal interpretation as well as to help you get past whatever state you're in right now. Henry's a really good guy for that. The reason that we put him on this webinar is because of his practical experience in a court of law. And so he can help you in terms of designing that plan and also being a litmus test to say, okay, does this meet the reasonability guidelines, and have you thought of this? And so Henry, thank you so much for your time and for your feedback. And so Luke, anything that we addressed that or did not address that you feel is important for the audience to know?
You know, just wanted to highlight again, just making sure that you have policies in place to address the work from home, to address, you know, cybersecurity issues. You know, phishing schemes are huge right now. We literally just had an employee fall for one last week. They got an email, what looked like from our CEO. It wasn't. They went out and bought $2,000 worth of iTunes gift cards and texted the codes to a random number. These things are happening every day. Companies are sending hundreds of thousands of dollars via wire, ACH. So if anyone wants to chat more about security and tightening up policies, you know, nothing we have is proprietary. Happy to have a conversation, share with you, either myself from an HR point of view, or bring in one of our security experts. We do panels, webinars all the time. Visit our website. You can find my contact information there. You can read our blog about a lot of these things that we talked about today as it relates to business operations, cybersecurity, and those types of things. So been a pleasure being with you guys and everyone today, and thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And Luke, just to summarize what I heard you say is that from your business, you're in the IT outsourcing business, but that you can also serve in a fractional capacity as a chief information officer. And so let's just say you're a small business and you need somebody from a CIO perspective to kind of give you that feedback on whether it's your telework policy, your COVID policy, or just to have a different set of eyes and ears with the specific expertise that you bring to the table. Your business does that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Our core business is fully outsourced IT. But we can carve out any number of our services and be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then wrapping it up, Anthony, could you wrap this up for us?
Sure. So I think a lot of
particular-
what's been focused on is what we've had to do as employers to make the workplace safe and make employees feel comfortable coming back to the office. I'd encourage each of you as leaders within your organizations to think about the things that you've wanted to do, because now, as much as the change has been kind of forced on us, now is a great time to also take some of those changes and drive some of that positive change that can make you an employer of choice and really set you apart as an employer, both for prospective employees and for clients. So I think it's a great opportunity, despite some of the great things that have been put in front of us that we've had to accomplish or get it put in the way.
Yeah. Okay. Well, to wrap up, guys, I can't thank you all enough for being available, for having this conversation. And I hope you guys didn't have phone calls like at 11 o'clock. So I apologize for running over. Just wanted to say to the attendees that we will be compressing this and putting it out on a YouTube page. We'll also be sharing it with the panelists as well, so you can share it with your customers and potential customers. Just wanted to say thank you so much for your time. And if there's no other questions, we'll wrap up the webinar right now. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, people signing off. Hey, Luke, you get best poses today, bud. You're stuck in a very...
That's, it's interesting. My Zoom webinar has the icon that says it's not responding, but on my end, it's perfectly fine.
Oh, I liked your last pose before because you're like this. And now you look a little bit more, you look stern right now.
Yeah, so, well,
Awesome.
as they say, it's always the IT person who works at the IT company who has the most IT issues.
Isn't yeah, I'm sure that's the case, but it's just odd because, we're the insurance people, not the IT people. And, if you'd have seen us fumbling around before this meeting, there's always, when you do the run through stuff you got to do. And, so we were able to get that done. We still have a few people on the line as well. Deborah Sofer. Hey, Deborah. I'm going to allow Deborah to talk if these people want to talk and ask questions.
I wondered where Luke went for a little while. I knew he wasn't Henry.
Yeah. So Holly Platt, welcome. Kim, welcome. Myrika, Julian, Myrika, welcome as well. If you guys want to ask some questions, great. Either that or they don't realize they got up to leave and they didn't realize that we're talking about it right now.
That might be it.
What's that?
I said that might be it. My Zoom is just completely crashed. I can't do anything, but I still can see you. So.
Wow.
Yeah. Luke, one thing I wanted to ask you, what I meant to ask before the call is, you had put together the Aldridge plan, so the COVID response plan, and Henry's going to send me. He has his own. I think I sent you guys his policy template. He's going to put his watermark on that and allow me to share that as part of this sending out of the webinar. And just if you wouldn't mind, just send me an email if you're okay with me sharing yours or not. And if you want to change it so your name's not on it or however you want to do it, just let me know, because we're going to post something about, it's more of a how-to. So it's what you need to be cognizant of as you're building a plan. His is very specific in that it's from a legal perspective, but for yours, it's a working document that you can use as a point of reference. So.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, you can share it as much as you'd like. With the caveat that a lot of it's very specific to our business and our office, but there's a lot of general stuff in there that's been pulled from the CDC, from local guidelines, those kind of things. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I think the general framework is important because you can say, okay, with this particular subject of let us just say that's the lunchroom. It's like, okay, I would have never thought about that, right? And so people might not even know what to think about. So that's, for me, that's the great part of having that. So, Luke, I appreciate you, man. You did a great job. Technology issues, being what they were, I thank you, because you could have just said, forget it, I'm not doing this. Technology is not working today for me, at least the Zoom isn't. So thank you. I sincerely appreciate you, bud.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't even consider the fact that I was clicking on Henry's link even though it says,
That's
I
pretty
just clicked
funny.
on the first thing I could since I was already late. So
Yeah, no, what's funny is when I said, hey, Luke Henry, I was talking to you.
it took me, we were a couple minutes in before I realized that that had even happened. So
Yeah, so that's my smart ass coming out. Sorry, bud.
no worries.
But thank you.
All right, guys. Well, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
Appreciate
no
it.
problem. Thank you.
Take care.